listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Happy evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. It's Friday. Welcome to your Friday. Welcome to my Friday. Welcome to the end of your day. And welcome to this program. This is the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. So come on over. Find all the different places where you can listen to this show in its audio format and find out all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. At the same time, you can come over to my YouTube channel, watch the video simulcast of this show tonight, and it'll be a kind of fun and exciting tonight because I got a lot of pictures to show you tonight. And you can only see those. You can't see them on the radio, but you can see them over at the video simulcast on YouTube. So come on over to youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts, and you're going to find the broadcast there, and also the live chat room going on right now with all of our Intrepids that like to come and join the broadcast and share their thoughts and their lives with each other a little bit. So it's kind of fun. It's kind of family-ish. So come on, at least in a digital text-driven way. So come on over and join the chat room and watch the video simulcast of the show. youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And you can see archives of all the shows that we've done over on that YouTube channel. Just scroll down on the page. You'll find over 300 videos there. And hopefully you'll enjoy those. And I think that's all I have for introduction for the show tonight. Other than to say there's lots of things going on in the world around us that we could talk about. Lots of current events. And every now and then we get into that. The beautiful thing about this show is I try to avoid that too much. But we take care of that over on Rocky's show, the Rocky Stucci Situation Room, where I join Rocky every day, 2 hours before this show starts, at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time, which is 8 o'clock Eastern. And this show starts at 9 o'clock Central Standard Time, 10 o'clock Eastern. But Rocky and I spend a lot of time talking about politics, current events, ghosty stuff, all different kinds of things that appeal to us and things that we like to talk about. But if you want to keep up on current events, come on over and listen to Rocky and me at 7 p.m. Central Standard, 8 p.m. Eastern, every day, Monday through Friday, over on Rocky's channel, Rocky Stucci Media. And that's ROCCISTUCCI, Rocky Stucci Media. And you can find us all, by the way. Just go over to, if you want to find a website that's got a link to everything he and I do together, you can go over to streamingtalkradio.com. And if you're watching the video, it's right down there. You'll see it. It'll come up. There's my son of a patriot. There's the website for the show, intrepidradio.com, which I don't do too much with, but there it is, streamingtalkradio.com. Go over there, you're going to see everything Rocky Stucci, everything Scotty Roberts, and the way to find all our shows. All right, we've been talking about Joseph from the Old Testament. There's something that needs saying about this series. It's like talking about Moses or any other biblical patriarch. We don't know where to draw the line sometimes between what is actual history and what is story. What is apologetic in its context and what is actual events. Many times you're going to find that in these ancient writings, especially when they have faith tied around them, is that the writers wanted to paint these characters in a light that was appealing to the audience to whom they were writing. Now, if Moses indeed is the man who penned the book of Genesis, where we find the story of Joseph, we've already seen his style of writing, as we talked about the Exodus. We talked about the life of Moses. We talked about the beginning of the conquest of Canaan after the Exodus. All of this stuff was written by Moses. And I don't think that there's any reason to believe it wasn't. That doesn't mean it wasn't enhanced or edited over the years by scribes. Remember, if Moses penned these first 5 books, he would have done so around 1400 BCE. Between 1440 and 1400 BCE was when he would have been writing. And 1,000 years later, in the 400s, Israel had already been a nation, already gone through its monarchy, had already been destroyed, had already been carried away, captive by the Persians, and then the Babylonians. And when they came back, remember I've talked about it many times, made reference to it many times, the 72 rabbis who in the early 400s went to Egypt and asked permission of the Egyptian pharaoh of the time, the Grecian pharaoh, Ptolemy II, if they could come to Alexandria and the Library of Alexandria and reconstruct the Hebrew texts, the Torah, the scriptures. Now remember, they always had this oral tradition, so they could always have it, but they had all these priests that would have known these oral traditions, but they wanted to find all the old scrolls, the old texts. And we think of the ancient world as all being way back there, and it all happened back there, but you got to think of it this way. Say you wrote something down on a piece of paper, and it was your life story, several pieces of paper, and you put it in a box somewhere, and then you moved a few times. You might have gone through famine, you might have gone through pandemic, you might have gone through a war, but you go back 40 years later to try to find that document that you've written, and you can't find it. What do you do to reconstruct that? We think in those terms. Forget digital age. Think of writing on paper, which was scarce enough to come by. And then think of the passage of time. If Moses wrote that stuff in the 1400s, and they'd gone through all of the Exodus, establishing the nation of Israel, the kings, the monarchies, all these scrolls of Moses would have been kept. Were kept in the temple, then the temple's destroyed, and they're carried away 1,000 years after the time of Moses. 1,000 years after this piece of paper was written. How many times did they copy this over? Well, they orally memorized these stories. And so, pardon the noise, you've got these scrolls now that after the captivity they wanted to reconstruct. That's why they had to do it. It's 1,000 years ago. And that's why when you have names of cities, which we're going to talk about tonight, with Joseph, Pi-Ramses, Avaris, they'd forgotten the name Avaris. Avaris would have been built back in the 1800s to 1700s BCE. And now it's the 400s. It's 1,300 years later. And so what did they know? They knew the city of Pi-Ramses, Pithom and Ramses. And they said those are the cities that the Hebrews built. Well, actually, it's the cities underneath that the Hebrews built. And Pharaoh Ramesses II rebuilt those about 150 years after the Exodus. And so this is what we're going to get into a bit tonight. And so I want to talk about, and I want to show you some pictures and have a little bit of fun with this. To me, this is fun. And so if you're listening, you're not going to see the images, you're not going to see the imagery. But you're going to be able to, I'll describe what I'm seeing. Some of it, you're just going to have to come over and take a look at what we're talking about here. Now, let's get back to first, before we show you some images, I want to get back to the story in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis. And remember, we left off with Joseph's reuniting with his brothers and revealing who he was. I always had this question, why didn't Joseph write home? If he spent 20 years in Egypt, and now he's risen to great power after the first few years there, and he's lived through the 7 years of famine, the 7 years of plenty, he's been established for then at least 15 years now as the, wait, this is in the middle of it all. So he's been established at least 7 years now as the Grand Vizier of Egypt. And in all this time, he never thought to go home. He never thought to write his dad to let him know he's alive. And so this is an unanswered question about Joseph. And maybe this is a flaw in the story, or it's just something we're not told. The Hebrew Bible contains many unanswered questions, and questions for which the answers provided seem fairly inadequate. But this is part of the charm of the Torah. It challenges us to exercise our powers of conjecture and our imagination to supply plausible responses. Now, if it's an important or a salvific thing in the Bible, I think that's one thing. If it's just a story that's being told, a cultural story, a story of their heritage, this is what the story of Joseph is, their history. It's leaving you to fill in some gaps. One of the most intriguing of these questions involves Joseph's behavior after he was risen to such heights in the Egyptian bureaucracy that he is second only to the Pharaoh. Now, you're going to recall that Joseph's brothers, jealous of his special place in his father Jacob's affections, and incensed at the hubris reflected in Joseph's dreams, they strip him of his many-colored coat, they cast him into a pit, and he's eventually sold into slavery in Egypt. And to explain Joseph's absence to their father, the brothers dip Joseph's coat in blood of a young goat, and they present it to Jacob as evidence that his beloved favorite son has been devoured by some wild beast. And Jacob refuses to be comforted in his grief. I'll go down to Sheol, mourning for my son. Thus his father bewailed him. Sheol being that afterlife. And after raising to high rank in the house of his master, Potiphar, chief steward to Pharaoh, Joseph lands in jail after Mrs. Potiphar screams rape after trying to seduce him, and he declined her advances. He's released from prison when a former prison mate, Pharaoh's butler, tells Pharaoh of Joseph's ability to interpret dreams. And upon his release, Joseph insightfully interprets Pharaoh's dreams as forecasting, after 7 years of abundance, a 7-year crop failure that must be planned for. Now, Pharaoh places Joseph in charge of the Egyptian economy. And Joseph then becomes the most powerful man in Egypt, except for Pharaoh. And Pharaoh even places his royal signet ring on Joseph's hand. So Pharaoh also gives Joseph an Egyptian name, Zaphnath-Paneah. Now, we could do a whole search on this name, there's some very interesting information about Zaphnath-Paneah. Well, it's interesting in the sense of the etymology of it, trying to decipher what it means, who it was, why that's Egyptian, why we don't see that name in Egyptian history. And Joseph also, by the way, got an Egyptian wife named Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. And during the years of plenty, Joseph and Asenath had 2 sons. And although securely ensconced in power, Joseph seemingly makes no attempt, so far as the text tells us, to communicate with his family back in Canaan. And it's obvious by the fact that his brothers had no idea who he was, and his father had no idea he was still alive. And he names his firstborn son Manasseh, meaning God has made me forget completely my hardship and my parental home. And interestingly, rabbinic tradition freely criticizes a number of aspects of Joseph's career. In the Midrash on Genesis, Joseph is criticized for asking his prison mate, the butler, to intercede for him when the butler's released. In other criticisms, some rabbis tell us that Joseph was on the point of yielding to Potiphar's wife's invitation to lie with her, and resisted only because the image of his mother and father cooled his passion. Now, this is rabbinic tradition. Judah Hanasi questions Joseph's decision to have his father embalmed before taking him back to Canaan for burial, since this is clearly a non-Jewish rite. Yet nowhere in the rabbinic tradition is there any criticism of Joseph for failing to communicate with his family back in Canaan during the years of plenty. Either it wasn't an issue with the rabbis, or they deliberately avoided the issue of the interest of promoting the image of the good Joseph. The problem, however, remains. Joseph never let anybody know he was alive. Why do you think he did that? What would you do? Your brothers were going to kill you. Instead, they sell you to slavery. You spend a few years as a steward. Then you're accused. You're thrown in prison. Then all of a sudden, you are raised to the second off the throne of Egypt, off the throne of the country where you're living. You're risen to great power. Are you going to communicate with that family back home? So Joseph's failure to communicate with his father during the 7 years of plenty, when he in effect was ruling Egypt beneath the Pharaoh, is especially puzzling in light of his solicitous attitude toward his father when his brothers come down to Egypt a second time for food during the famine. How is your aged father of whom you spoke? Is he still in good health? Joseph asks of his brothers. So when Benjamin, Jacob's youngest son, the younger brother now of Joseph, is found with Joseph's silver goblet in his sack, and we skipped that part of the story last night. There's a little drama that's thrown in there that Joseph has them place a silver goblet in the bag of Benjamin, and then they follow them as they send them home with goods, and they find the silver goblet there, and Joseph has him arrested and so on. He's going to keep him there. I don't know what he's plotting here, but Joseph has it planted, this silver goblet, so Benjamin can be accused of stealing it. And Judah, one of the older brothers, makes his great appeal for mercy to Joseph, which we read a bit last night. And Joseph's still concealing his identity at that point. And let me remain here as your slave, Judah pleads, but release Benjamin. And the word father appears 14 times in this speech, as if to emphasize Jacob's unrelieved grief at the loss of his son Joseph, as if to appeal to Joseph's feeling for his father. Now, as one commentator noted, the true beauty of Judah's remarks lies in his ability to affirm explicitly his own responsibility, while effectively blaming Joseph for his father's anticipated death. At the same time, Judah's speech implicitly poses the question raised in this article: why did Joseph never call home? Why didn't he ever let them know? Why didn't he even send a letter? And I think these biblical characters, it's very interesting about them. While there's apologetic written around them, while there's stories to give Israel history, at the same time, you always see the flaws of these people. Maybe this is a fatal flaw of Joseph's. Not fatal, a flaw of Joseph's. So the problem is hardly a technical one. True, there weren't any telephones, but as Pharaoh's second in command, Joseph could have easily dispatched messengers back into Canaan to convey the good news of his survival and his subsequent political elevation. Admittedly, his administrative tasks were time-consuming and onerous, but this certainly didn't preclude communicating with a beloved father. And we'll see later, his duties doesn't prevent him from traveling back to bury his father. And so, biblical characters in Genesis habitually fail to communicate very well. You will find this in many stories of patriarchs and characters in Genesis. And maybe this is a flaw of Moses, because he's the one who wrote these stories. And they don't communicate well with their family members, and especially with ancestral homes. In this, Joseph is no exception. Abraham makes his epochal trek from Paddan Aram to Canaan, and he establishes himself in his new environment. Although his immediate family and his nephew Lot accompanied him to the new frontier, other members of the clan remained behind until Abraham sends his servant Eliezer back to Paddan Aram to find a wife for his son Isaac. So Abraham makes no attempt to contact members of the extended family he'd left behind. Even recognizing this difficulty in an era without modern means of communications, it still seems odd that no messages were ever sent back before Eliezer's journey. Joseph's father, Jacob, is likewise guilty of a communications failure. After spending 22 years acquiring 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, who are sisters, 2 concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah, and 13 children in Laban's household in Paddan Aram, Jacob heads back for Canaan. So far as we're informed by the text, Jacob made no attempt during his stay in Paddan Aram to establish contact with his mother, Rebekah, or his brother Esau, whose birthright he'd stolen. And one can understand his reluctance to contact Esau. Esau had threatened to kill him. But the moral lapse in not contacting his mother appears inexplicable, and Joseph seems to be following the same pattern in this line. But this is hardly an explanation or an excuse. Joseph's failure to contact his brothers is more understandable than his failure even to let his father know he was alive. Would you want to contact those brothers? That'd be like I'd probably send a party out to massacre, arrest them, put them on pikes at my party. After what the brothers did to him, Joseph had his reasons. Yet his failure to contact his brothers may be intertwined with Joseph's failure to contact his father. Did Joseph have some deep-seated antagonism toward his father, as he did toward his brothers? Elie Wiesel, who was a Jewish apologist, in a bold exegetical thrust, has suggested that Jacob originally sent Joseph to find his brothers at Shechem, where they threw him in a pit because the patriarch wanted Joseph to be killed. The motive, still the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac, the memory of Mount Moriah, where Abraham placed Isaac on the altar, at Peniel, where Jacob struggled with the angel. Jacob had wanted to imitate Isaac. Here he could be wishing to emulate Abraham by sacrificing his favorite son. Now, it's a great conjecture, but it places excessive dependence on imputing to Jacob a dark motive that just seemed inconsistent with his character in the text. So another possible explanation for Joseph's antagonism to his father is that he might have seen himself as the victim of an obsessive fatherly love. Joseph was the son of Jacob and Rachel. And Rachel, whom Jacob loved more than Leah. As the Bible tells us, Jacob showered attention on the young lad because of that. And so Joseph doesn't understand the disfiguring nature of the attention that his father lavished on him when he was a younger man. But when he attains manhood and maturity in Egypt, he grasps the enormity of his father's unhealthy preoccupation with him. And here there's a striking parallel with Jacob's own experience with his mother, Rebekah. And so this goes on, and we have to question why Joseph never wrote back, why he never let his father know he was alive. No hypothesis can bridge the discontinuities and resolve the ambiguities by itself. There can be no definitive answer because so many logical conjectures appear appropriate. It's as if the divine narrator created a set of circumstances that prompts the astute observer, us, and the readers, to pose one question to which there's no correct answer, but which focuses on the moral dilemmas raised by Joseph's success in Egyptian society. Joseph really becomes the paradigm of the Jew living in a non-Jewish culture, so completely that he forgets to call home. And we see this, by the way, when Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt. There's not many of them that are Jehovah worshippers at that point. They're all assimilated Egyptians by that point. So perhaps a question about this is not so much why didn't Joseph call home, but rather after all those years of intoxicating success and acceptance in Egyptian society, he was willing and able to reassert his Israelite origins and return to the fold. That may be the real challenge of the Joseph story, especially for us nowadays, any kind of application. After all he had gained, why go back? It's an interesting concept. When we come back, we're going to look at some pictures over on the YouTube channel, and we're going to talk about where Joseph is at this point, and a little bit more about who he is and his neck a long time. Israel said to Joseph, Jacob, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you were still alive." It's 20 years later. And Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, "I will go up and tell Pharaoh, and say to him, My brothers and my father's household who were in the land of Canaan have come to me. The men are shepherds. Their work has been to feed livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have." Now here is the key to having a little glimpse of what time period Joseph is living in. And Joseph says, when Pharaoh calls you and asks, "What is your occupation?" you shall say, "Your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, so that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, because every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians." Now there's a key for you. We've talked about this in the past. But Joseph is saying, Pharaoh's going to give you this land, and I'm arranging it, but I got to get his final stamp of approval on it. He's going to meet with you. He's going to interview you. He's going to see who you are, what you're like. He's going to ask you what you do for a living. And you tell him that you're shepherds. You raise livestock, and that you've done this since the days of your youth. And you tell him this so he'll give you this land in Goshen, because every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So there's the conflict. It's seemingly a contradicting statement. What you've got here is Joseph saying, go to the Pharaoh of Egypt, tell him you're shepherds in order to get the land, because the Egyptians hate shepherds. And that makes no sense until you start looking at the history. And you say, if the Hyksos, known as the shepherding kings, the kings from foreign lands, and you realize that the Egyptians, the real Egyptians, the blood Egyptians, down in the south in Luxor, Thebes at the time, that they grew to hate shepherding peoples because of the Hyksos, because of all these people that had infiltrated in and had overtaken the northern kingdom. They called them the shepherding kings, and they hated shepherds because of this. It became a traditional hatred. So I hate shepherds. That's like saying, I hate you and the horse you rode in on. That's kind of the Egyptians with the Hyksos. We hate you for taking the northern kingdom and the horse you rode in on and the livestock. You're shepherds. And so Joseph is telling his brothers, you tell the Pharaoh you're shepherds because the Egyptians hate shepherds. Well, why is he telling them that? Because it aligns Joseph and his family as being from Canaan, from the Middle Eastern region, which is the same place these Hyksos peoples came from. So he's aligning, he's making an affinity, a relation. We're cousins. And so this dates Joseph. Joseph is appointed to his position as Grand Vizier by a Hyksos king, a king who grants his family land on the basis that they're shepherds because the Egyptians hate shepherds. So the Egyptian Pharaoh, wouldn't he hate them if they're shepherds? Well, he's not Egyptian, he's Hyksos. They've taken over the northern kingdom. So there is a clue for you right there, how we can view the timing of Joseph. Now, that's not solid scientific, dated fact. What that is, it's almost a sidebar that's telling you part of the story that reveals who they're dealing with. And that would have fallen only into this 108-year period, one of those kings, and probably very early on. So, in the passage, Genesis 47, Joseph went and told Pharaoh, my father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds and all they possess have come from the land of Canaan and are now in the land of Goshen. And he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh asked his brothers, what's your occupation? And they said, your servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers. And then they said to Pharaoh, "We've come to sojourn in the land, for your servants have no pasture for their flocks, because the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore please allow your servants to dwell in the land of Goshen." And Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and your brothers dwell in the best of the land. Have them dwell in the land of Goshen. And if you know any capable men among them, then put them in charge over my livestock." So when Joseph brought in Jacob and his father and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed the Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How old are you?" Jacob said to the Pharaoh, "The days of my years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. My days of the years of my life have been few and evil, and they are not attained in the days of the years of the lives of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage." And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So Joseph settled his father and brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best part of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. It's the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. This is not Pharaoh Ramesses. The land of Ramesses is the land that 1,000 years after the writing of this text, the scribes knew Goshen, the city of Avaris, to be the land of Ramesses, because Ramesses had reclaimed it. They didn't know the older name. That's like I compare it to how many of you call New York City New Amsterdam? None of us. How many of us are aware that it was the Dutch that founded New Amsterdam and the British who changed it to New York? I'm bringing it to a little smaller situation, St. Paul, Minnesota, not far from here. Capital Minnesota. No, hardly anybody living in St. Paul, Minnesota today realizes that 150 years ago the name of the city was Pig's Eye. It was a mill city on the river. Pig's Eye. And so Pig's Eye did not become the capital of Minnesota. They changed the name to St. Paul. St. Paul is the capital of Minnesota. So that's only 150 years ago. How many people know that 150 years ago St. Paul was named Pig's Eye? A few people know, because there used to be the famous Pig's Eye beer brewery up here. That's why many people knew that. And kind of miss that beer. It's gone now. But the same thing with Avaris, the same thing with calling this land of Goshen the land of Ramesses, because when it was rewritten by the scribes 1,000 years later, reconstructed this scriptural text, that's the only thing they knew. You don't find the word Avaris anywhere in the Hebrew text because they didn't know it anymore. They knew it as Pi Ramses in the land of Ramses. But this is the land that the Pharaoh gave to them. The Pharaoh was not Ramses. So, then it goes through the story in the text of Joseph and the famine, Jacob's request of Joseph to not let him stay, that if he dies, to bury him in his homeland. And Jacob gives a blessing to Joseph and his sons. And then he dies. Jacob says to Joseph, "I'm about to die, but God will be with you and return you again to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I've given to you one portion more than your brothers, which I took out of the hand of the Amorites with my sword and my bow." And Jacob called to his sons and said, "Gather yourselves together that I may tell you what will befall you in the last days." And he goes through for each of his sons and tells them their inheritance, who they shall be, and then he dies. And then he charged them and he said to them all, "I'm about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre in the land of Canaan," and you can go visit the cave of Machpelah today, which Abraham brought along with the field of Ephron and the Hittite as a burial place. And they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife there. They buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife there. And I buried Leah there. The field and the cave that is there were purchased from the children of Heth. And when Jacob finished instructing his sons, he drew his feet into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. He died. and went to be with his ancestors. That's an interesting reference, isn't it? In a Jewish book, he went to his ancestors. He went to his people. And it says that Joseph fell on his father's face and wept. And he commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel, and 40 days were required for him, for such is the time required for those who were embalmed. And then the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. And when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, and he asked to go up and bury his father in Canaan, which he does. And then his brothers come to him after that, and they said, their father was dead. They said amongst themselves, the brothers now, perhaps Joseph is going to hate us now, and he'll certainly pay us back for all the wrong we did to him 20 years ago. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died, saying, say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the transgressions of your brothers and their sin. They're sending him a letter. Remember, this is what Dad said before he died. He said, you forgive us, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the transgressions of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also went and fell down before his face. Like the sheaves in Joseph's dream, they all bowed down on their faces to him. We are your servants, they said to Joseph. And Joseph said to them, don't be afraid, for I am in the place of God. For am I in the place of God? But as for you, you intended to do me harm, but God intended it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many lives. So now don't fear me. I will provide for you and your little ones. So he comforted them and spoke kindly to all his brothers. And then Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Now, this 110 years is what the ancient Egyptians saw as the perfect length of life. And there were a few who attained this. John Ward, in our book on the Exodus reality, and his candidate for Moses was Amenemhet, son of Hapu. And he lived to be 110 years old, and he was deified in his lifetime. So Joseph lived to be the perfect age of an Egyptian. What would you call him? A deified Egyptian. So Joseph said to his brothers, oh, by the way, it says he lived to 110 years old, and Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation, meaning his great-grandchildren. And also the children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were brought up on Joseph's knees. So remember, he's still a relatively young man in Egypt. If he lived to be 110, he was alive for probably another 70 years after these events. And Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die. God will surely come to you and bring you out of this land, to the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here when you leave here, and bring them back to Canaan. So Joseph died at the age of 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Then we go to Exodus chapter 1. And I want you to hear something. This is that's, by the way, how the book of Genesis ends, with the death of Joseph. Now, Exodus chapter 1, it goes through all the names of the sons of Israel, the 12 tribes. And Joseph died, as did all his brothers and all that generation. Nevertheless, the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, and they multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them in Goshen. Now, here's your historical point in the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 8. Now there rose up a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, surely the people of the sons of Israel are more numerous and powerful than we are. Come and let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, And it come to pass that when any war breaks out, they will rejoin our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. And therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their labor. And they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses, or you could almost state which are now called Pithom and Ramses after the time of Ramses. But the more they afflicted the Israelites, the more they multiplied and grew. Now, this is a historical point. The Pharaoh who did not have any regard for Joseph, he knew not Joseph. He had no regard for him, is what that means. And he said the Israelites, the Canaanites, are growing in number. We need to stop this, lest they rise up when any war breaks out and rejoin our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Now, they weren't slaves at this point, but this new Pharaoh, I believe, is none other than Amos the First, who drove the Hyksos out of northern Egypt, and Egypt reunified. And the remnant left behind after the ousting of the Hyksos after 108 years, remember Joseph lived to be 110, so he lived through this whole period. And his brothers all died. He buried them all there. And now a new Pharaoh comes up and says, we don't know, no regard for this Joseph. And let's watch them more closely. Let's put them into bondage, lest they rejoin our enemies who we just ousted, the Hyksos. So there's another historical factor there when you start to look at this. Now, I want to give you, I said I was going to do this at the beginning of the show. I want to show you some fun pictures. They're fun for me. I hope they are fun for you as well. This is going to give you an idea of what's going on. I'm going to bring up, first of all, a map. All right. I put this little map together. Take a look at your screens. Now you're going to see northern Egypt here. You see Cairo right smack in the middle. This is modern-day Cairo. Is in that region. If you look a little south, it's about 25, 30 miles south of downtown Cairo. You get to downtown Memphis, which is a little town, or that's Amenemhet. This would be the town where the Egyptians had their northern palaces. This is the town where Hatshepsut sent her young stepson, Thutmose III, to be raised. And he grew up in the palace there in Amenemhet. And if you look also, you see in between these two and off to the west a little bit to the left, you see Giza. That's the Giza Plateau with the pyramids and so on. And just a little south of them, just outside of Memphis and Amenemhet, is the stepped pyramid of Djoser. And so this is Cairo. This is at the mouth of the Nile Delta. And you see the Nile flowing south. Goes south for about 400 miles. You hit Luxor. Now, if you go up northeast of Cairo, you see I've got there Goshen in the big kind of phased out letters. And the red dot up there is Avaris, which is Pyramses. This is the town where, if the palace is in Memphis, this is the town where Avaris sits, where the palace of Joseph is. This is the land, the region that he asks for his brothers and his family. And that's about, roughly, you're looking at this, Memphis is roughly 60 to 70 miles from Avaris. And now if you see where it's located up there, I want you to look to a reference we made when we were talking about Moses. Look just south of Avaris and Pyramses. You're going to see the Wadi Tumilat. Remember I talked about this is the Wadi, that fertile little crescent where it fills with water once a year. That's why it's still green all the time. This is the trade route that the Israelites would have used to get over to the northern tip of the Red Sea. And you see the Wadi Tumilat arcs around and comes down to the north side of the Bitter Lakes, or the Sea of Reeds, which is where I believe they crossed the Red Sea. You can see down south of there is the Red Sea itself, and then the Sinai out to the east. And so this is a map of the area to kind of give you an idea of what's going on. Let's go a little further. Here's Avaris, map number 2. Now, by the way, go back to map number 1 here. You see where Avaris and Pi-Ramses is? Let's blow that up. Right here, Avaris. Now, this is Avaris. You see way up at the top, slightly to the left of center, Avaris Tel El Daba, which is what it's called today. And there's an arrow pointing to that little dot there. It's outside of Kantir. And this is where Avaris was in the land of Goshen. And if you look down south, you see the Wadi Tumalat again. Now, this gives you the lay of the land a bit. If the Israelites lived in Goshen, and Avaris was kind of the capital of Goshen, Goshen spread out to the west and the south from this point. And so if the Israelites are leaving from Goshen, they would just hop down onto the Wadi Tumalat and walk over to the northern tip of the Sea of Reeds. And so this is just a map to kind of show you what that looks like and how it's laid out. Now, if we zoom in even closer on that little dot of Tel El Daba, this is Tel El Daba today by a Google satellite map. This is the town today. And this is where Avaris was. You see to the left of center, there's a little dot that says Tel El Daba. It says temporarily closed. That's the excavation site of Tel El Daba. You can see the modern day town that's wrapped around it on the south and to the east. And Tel El Daba was the fields that were dug up in this whole area. If you look very closely, you can even see the outlines of the squares of buildings. Tel El Daba is ancient Pi-Ramses, which was ancient Avaris. And this is where they found the palace of Joseph, and they believe it's his palace. Now I'm going to show you a couple of other pictures here that you might enjoy. Let's go to... let me turn some of these off for you. Okay. Let's look at the palace. This is the palace they discovered at Avaris, and it matches the description of Joseph's palace in the book of Genesis. Now here it is. I showed this to you yesterday. The little pyramid off to the left of this picture, that's a tomb that they uncovered. And the rest of these buildings, as you go up above that little pyramid and off to the right, crossing over, you see all those tombs there that were uncovered. And then you see the white palace in the background of Joseph, I believe it was. And that palace, from another angle, looks like this. And you see here there are 12 pillars that they've uncovered. And according to the Old Testament description of Joseph's palace, he built it with 12 pillars to represent what? To represent his 12 brothers. And so here's just another view of that palace. And then out in that tomb, if you look in this picture, you look way at the top center, you can see that pyramidal tomb out there. They discovered a statue. This is what that statue looked like. And I want to show you something here. This is the way they found that statue. It looked like this, and it was fragmented, and it was deliberately, the face was deliberately chiseled away. This is what the head of that statue looks like right now. It looks like this, and it's in a museum. And you can see the chisel marks below the hairline. It had the mushroom kind of domed wig. And what's very interesting about this, if you look on the back side, you can see you can see the hair was painted red, the skin on the neck there, it's painted yellow, and you can see the striping on the garment, which is to match a Canaanite garment. And so this statue of Joseph, right here as it's reconstructed, he's holding the flail. You can see it in his hand. It would be his left hand. It's his right hand as you're looking at him. And he's holding the flail. It almost blends in with the striping of the clothes, but you see this kind of almost boomerang-shaped thing that's going up from his hand. He's clutching it in his hand and up over his shoulder. This was a symbol of office. Anybody who was not royal would not have one of these in a statue made of him. So Joseph is being shown as being a royal. Now, is this Joseph? We aren't 100% sure, but it matches the land of Goshen. It matches Avaris, the city where he built his palace. It matches the cloak of a Canaanite, the red-headed wig that many of them wore, the cultural style. It has the yellow skin of a Canaanite, and it has him as being a high official, having the flail in his hand, and or the scepter, I'm sorry. And many believe that this is the statue of none other than Joseph, which was found smashed to bits in the tomb outside the palace in Goshen. And who would have smashed it? All we know is that the Israelites, when they, at the Exodus, a few hundred years after Joseph lived, they went back, they took his body out of his tomb, and there are signs in this tomb of having been tunneled into, and there's no corpse in there, no mummy, and there's the smashed statue at its feet, and the statue was about twice the size of life. And they found this statue smashed. Who smashed it? Would it have been the Israelites? To not leave it behind when they left Egypt and they took the bones of Joseph with them? That's a good question. So we may talk about this a little bit more on Monday. We're out of time today. We're way out of time. And so, folks, I want to thank you for being here. Going to see you on Sunday at 9 a.m. for It's Sunday. Hope you enjoyed this story of Joseph. We'll probably wrap it up on Monday. So thanks for being here. Have a good night.